and we are live. In this live video, I'm going to talk about what the difference is between a full floating rear axle, what you find in the F-250, and a semi full floating rear axle is what you find in a light duty truck. Uh, like what I have here, my F-150, and there's my wife's F-150 there. She also would have a semi full floating rear end. So, um, really, the main difference between a semi full floating rear end and a full floating rear end is the fact that the axles on a full floating rear end don't have to carry the load of the vehicle or whatever else is in the truck. The axle only carries the torque of the truck, and the bearings actually are on the axle housing, and those carry the weight of the load, while the axle only provides torque to propel the vehicle forward, which is pretty important. Say if you're snow plowing or carrying heavy loads, heavy towing, you're in these really extreme conditions, your axles have less work to do and they're a lot heavier. They're bigger, heavier axles, and they're only carrying torque, not weight and torque. So basically, the difference, and what I'm trying to say is, the bearings in this light duty rear end, they're actually riding on the axle shaft itself. So the shaft goes into the differential housing, and it has a little C-clip that holds the shaft into the vehicle. And then the bearings that are in the end of the axle housing are actually contacting the axle and riding on the axle, and that is so essentially the axle carries the load of the vehicle and it provides the torque. So it twists and the bearing rides on the axle and carries the load. So the axle has two jobs in this situation. Well, even you could even say it has three jobs. It keeps the wheel on the truck. So if you ever were to break an axle on a light duty truck, which is more likely because it carries the load and it carries the torque, which is important. Why it's so important that you don't really go over the ratings for these trucks. Usually the ratings for the axle is limited to the springs. But for example, say a guy comes in and puts heavier springs on a light duty truck. Now the truck sits up higher, but now you're at the point where your axles are now overloaded. And if you ever break an axle, which is possible, you keep in mind, your bearings are on the axle. And if you ever break one, your wheel would actually come off of the vehicle because the axle actually carries the torque, it carries the load, and it holds the wheel on the vehicle. So these lug nuts are actually splined into the axle, and the lateral motion, say side to side motion, is actually on the axle as well, because the axle is actually located in the differential. In the case of a light duty truck, there's a little clip. If you were to go inside that cover there, open up that cover, take off a bolt, and slide out a little clip, you'd actually give the tire a little push to release any tension that's potentially on the clip, drop this clip, and you could pull that whole axle. You can pull that whole axle out of the shaft and out of the truck. So if the axle were ever to break, the wheel would come off of the truck. Now, looking at the full floating rear end, extremely rare for a pickup truck to break an axle. I've seen on semi trucks that are in really heavy duty, like gravel haulers that haul like thousands and thousands, I'm going to say like 40,000-50,000 pounds loads of like hard fill rock, stuff like that. I've seen those trucks break axles that are like this thick, like thick, heavy duty axles. I've seen them break, and they're full floating rear ends, obviously. But the benefit to having a full floating rear end where the axle, if the axle were to break, the wheel would not come off of the vehicle, similar to what would happen to a light duty truck if an axle were to break. The wheel would not come off of the vehicle if in the event of an axle failure. Usually on a heavy duty truck, the axles are pretty stout. I've never really seen or heard of a heavy duty pickup truck breaking an axle. But if it ever did happen, you'd still have your wheel and you'd be able to steer the truck to safety. Compared to a light duty truck, the wheel would just come off. Another benefit to having a full floating axle, and I believe full floating is the idea that the axle's actually floating in the tube and floating. If you were to take off this cover and see the 8 nuts holding the behind this cover, those actually are holding the axle shaft to the wheel. And if you took those off, you could just slide that shaft out with the wheel on and everything. So that's why it's floating. It's literally floating in the axle. Now, another benefit to having the full floating rear end is instead of having one bearing that rides on your axle, you have 2 bearings to carry the load. So you have twice as much load carrying ability as far as bearings. So you have better bearings. And on top of that, they're not riding on the axle. So they're not carrying torque. They're just carrying the load where the axle provides torque. So that's what makes it full floating. I think the front axle can also be considered a full floating axle, because the same situation, if you were to break an axle, you wouldn't lose the wheel. It's technically a full floating axle as well as the rear. But anyway, that's it for axle talk and whatnot. Here's a look at a 250. I actually got the plow hooked up to it because doing some work on the garage. Check it out. I had to rebuild all these fascia boards. It was a horrible project, took forever. It's been brutal. I've been working on this thing like crazy. I did all the soffits here along the sides. Redid all of it. Just gotta caulk all the cracks and paint it. It sucked. It was brutal work. I'm not really a carpenter, so it took me a long time. I had to move the plow from right here so I could get up there and nail the soffit and fascia boards up all the way down to the back. I'm gonna have to put the siding back up on the garage, but still gotta paint it, put in new drip edge, and still paint, drip edge, caulk. It's never ending. But yep, lawnmowers. Been doing a lot of bush removal lately. Here's the camera. Been doing a lot of bush removals with the super saw. Definitely a good tool to have. But anyway, that's it for the video. Thank you for watching. Have a great day and talk to you later.